Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Diablo 3 Build Factory. My name is Phobos and today's episode is a basic review episode of episode 1. I wasn't really that satisfied with this episode anymore because it is basically 3 months old and since patch 1.0.4 a lot has changed. The initial release was really kind of buggy and a lot of skills were exploited, such as smokescreen for instance. These skills were changed so fast, and since my video was released 1 week after the initial release, I figured okay, now with patch 1.0.4 I should definitely re-release this episode and review it for good measure. Actually, today's episode is meant for newcomers or for people who haven't been around and are just considering to come back and want a quick build update on what has changed and what is still viable and what is not. This episode could also be interesting for people who want to farm Act 3 or Act 4 on Inferno and are really not that certain about their build. So if you want that little advice or that little edge over the enemy, check out this episode. I'm certain you will find out something new. Now, I'd say without further ado, let's get us started and let's talk about damage and survivability after patch 1.0.4. First of all, I can say with good confidence that these build options are viable for all of Inferno. That means from Act 1 to Act 4. It is really no problem to farm with these attacks and with these options whatsoever. I have hundreds of hours of experience with the Demon Hunter, so you should be okay with these build options as well. And I think if you search for different build options, you sooner or later come across something like that anyways. Of course, the game is still dependent on your gear, but overall Inferno mode has become a lot easier compared to the initial release, so don't sweat it too much. Let's talk about damage first, and when I'm talking about damage I mean the overall picture. So let's say single target damage and multi-target and area of effect damage. Since patch 1.0.4 you have a lot of more options. There are a lot of more viable options since then, and basically you can make every primary skill work if you want to. The question now is, how effective is that? So if you really are into Untitled Shot for instance, you can make that work. Grenades are still not really that viable, but if you are going for a tank build with a lot of life leech, that can work as well. If you want further information on these different skills, I would recommend consulting episode 15 and 16 of the Build Factory. I talk about these skills on these episodes as well. But since we want to talk about skill setups and builds which basically work with a general setup of gear and with gear which you don't have to pay a fortune for, I'd say we talk about the two most viable options for the Demon Hunter, and of course that is Hungering Arrows and Baller Shots. If you're interested in the theory behind Hungering Arrows, I'd recommend checking out episode 20 of the Build Factory here on my channel. So if you're interested in the theory behind that and how much damage each and every rune does, I'd recommend checking it out. It's really good information. So, Hungering Arrows and Baller Shots, which is more viable? I used both of these skills for dozens of hours and I can say that both of them were viable prior to patch 1.0.4, but with the patch and the initial buff for the Baller Shots, they are as viable than ever. They are really strong now and you can really make them work even easier now than before. But let's talk about Hungering Arrows first. Theoretically, they have the highest damage output of all hatred regenerating abilities, that is the primary attacks of course. They are really easy to use since they are homing, so if you want to attack a target which is basically pretty far away or which is around the corner or something like that, chances are that the Hungering Arrows will follow their target. It is sometimes the case that Hungering Arrows do a 180-degree turn to hit a target. That's not something that is not that uncommon. So it is really easy to use this skill, although it isn't really the highest velocity skill that you can choose from. Its emphasis is clearly the single target damage, although there are a few options which are destined to be for AoE or multi-target damage. Since you can't decide where the hungering arrows fly or which target they should hit and which they shouldn't, it really doesn't matter whatsoever anyways, so just hit the target hard and fast and you'll be good. As for the bowler shots, they received a buff, so Thunderball, Acid Strike, I talked about these skills on the latest skill change review episode of the Build Factory. What I didn't talk about is Imminent Doom, and if you remember episode 1, Imminent Doom with bowler shots was the skill of my choice, and I used the skill, like I already said in the intro, for dozens of hours, and it worked just fine. I wasn't really missing anything. So basically bowler shots with Imminent Doom is even more viable now than it was before, since the damage is now increased prior to patch 1.0.4. The emphasis of the skill is clearly AoE, but you can also make it work for single targets. It really doesn't matter whatsoever, since you target one enemy and if enemies are close by to that target, they get damage as well. So what's the point? You can target and hit as many targets as you want. It really doesn't matter. The skill is a high velocity skill, which really comes in handy in some cases, especially when you're kiting enemies from far away. It is really awesome to just shoot them with bowler shots when they are not even on the screen yet. This is something I really like about the skill. It is really awesome. And I'd really say it is more viable than ever since 1.0.4. If you're really into the skill, I'd say try to make it work. If your gear is not up to par yet, just wait a little and go back to hungering arrows maybe, and if your gear just got better slightly or even significantly, I'd say just go back to bowler shots if you're really into them. It's really not the problem whatsoever. You can even make it work against Diablo or GOM or any other boss or any other champion on Inferno. Just have confidence. Now that's it for the hatred regenerating abilities. I'd say let's talk about single target damage next, because single target damage is really important for Inferno. You want skills that burst the enemy down as fast as possible. This is especially important if you're going up against bosses like GOM for instance, or even Diablo as well. It is really important that you have that one spell which you can use to nuke down champions, uniques and bosses. So I'd recommend two skills in particular, and that are Impale and Cluster Arrow. Let's talk about Impale first. Impale is a high velocity and high damage output spell which is destined to be single target damage. There are a few runes which are usable for multi-target damage, but I wouldn't recommend them. If you are in between, I would say choose either Chemical Burn or Grievous Wounds. And with 25 hatred per Impale, this is a really good trade in comparison to the damage you inflict to your enemies. And speaking of Chemical Burn, this rune also received a buff from 125% damage over 2 seconds on hit to a 220% damage over 2 seconds. So it is even stronger than before, and I would really recommend going for Chemical Burn, since you need a lot of critical hit chance to make Grievous Wounds work efficiently. And until then, Chemical Burn is the better choice. I did a whole episode about that. Better check it out if you are interested in the theory and the numbers behind it. Concerning cluster arrows basically change concerning the rune choice. So if you go for cluster bombs for instance, cluster bombs are kind of more AoE centric or multi-target damage centric than compared to Load for Bear for instance. But since we are talking about single target damage at the moment, let's talk about cluster arrows with Load for Bear. Load for Bear or cluster arrows itself are a high velocity spell with a high damage output as well. They are very hatred heavy though. I said it time and time again, but 50 hatred is a lot. You really have to aim properly to make this one count. Chances are that if you miss 1 or 2 times, you basically run out of hatred already. So I would recommend use cluster arrows only if you're certain that you're going to hit your target. The awesome thing about cluster arrows is that you can use it for single target damage, but in case there are more enemies around that certain target, they will be hit as well, since miniature bombs will going to spawn from that cluster arrow. So that's a nice addition as well, since that miniature bomb will also damage the target you choose as well. So you basically do a lot of damage, that's for certain. But remember, 50 hatred is 50 hatred, that's a lot. You can't underestimate how much and how fast the hatred will be burned through if you use a lot of cluster arrow attacks. And since we're talking about the load for Bear Rune, this skill as well received a buff from 390% damage to 304. But like I already said in the skill change review episode prior to this episode of the Build Factory, they should have decreased the hatred cost instead. Cluster arrows were a viable skill prior to patch 1.0.4. This slight damage buff nearly does nothing that really is recognizable. Decreasing the hatred cost would have been more efficient for the Demon Hunter. Now, since we're done with single target damage, let's talk about multi-target and area of effect damage. And let's start with elemental arrows. Elemental arrows are still the most popular spell, or the most popular multi-target damage spell among demon hunters, and rightfully so, because there's a big variety of runes you can choose from, and all of them are viable for Inferno difficulty. So if you get bored of one choice, you can basically pick another and you're good. So let's talk about Nether Tentacles first. Nether Tentacles back then used to be the go-to spell. There was nothing compared to this skill. If you remember my first episode about the Build Factory, you remember me talking about the skill like there's nothing in comparison to it. And that's correct. Back then you could hit multiple targets multiple times, and you didn't really need any other area of effect damage skill other than Nether Tentacles, so it was insane. Today things are different. This skill is nerfed and it doesn't hit the same target more than once anymore. It can hit multiple targets, but not more than once, and that used to be one of its strengths. It still has its life leech ability, but it is still very slow, so if you're fighting fast or teleporting enemies, you still run into a lot of problems if you use Nether Tentacles. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work, you just have to be more precise, and it doesn't do as much damage as back then. So in my opinion, if you're not in a need for life leech, there are better options, and options I would recommend over Nether Tentacles. And if you remember my initial episode about Nether Tentacles nerfed what now, I talk about frost arrows. And frost arrows are a good alternative to Nether Tentacles. They have a good damage output and they snare enemies since it is frost damage. And you don't have to forget that they split up once they hit a target, so they can be used for area of effect purposes. And that comes quite in handy, because you can basically hit a single target with frost arrows, snare it, and in case that one target spawns more minions, for instance, or more minions appear on the screen, you can basically snare them as well, and kiting is a lot easier if the targets are not on their full speed. It is really nice and a nice skill to have, and I work with it for quite some time now and I'm really satisfied. Another rune choice I didn't talk about in any of my videos yet, but is as viable as any other rune choice I talked about yet, is Screaming Skull for elemental arrows. This skill in particular is really awesome to keep enemies at bay. You have a 40% chance to fear an enemy, and the damage output is slightly less compared to frost arrows, for instance. It is still on par in my opinion, since you don't have to forget that this skill pierces enemies so you can hit multiple targets at once. And speaking of keeping enemies at bay, fearing them is as good as a stun in my opinion, because basically when you are kiting enemies and they are really fast, for instance, you hit them with Screaming Skull and they will start walking in the other direction, so you can really keep them at a distance and don't have any problems whatsoever. If you combine it with baller shots, for instance, like you can see in the footage, this is really awesome, because baller shots are a high velocity spell. You hit them with Screaming Skull, they start running back, and you start to spam them with baller shots. The synergies effect are really awesome, and I'd recommend taking a look if you have problems with kiting enemies and keeping them at bay. Now I want to talk about the 3 skills I also talked about in episode 1, and that are Twin Chakrams, Spike Trap with Scatter, and Multi-Shot. These skills are really awesome for AoE purposes. Sometimes it is really awesome to have that one skill, other than elemental arrows for instance, that plows through a lot of enemies at once. So if you want to take one of these skills into your build, you can't go wrong, unless you want a different emphasis on your build. But if you want to go against a lot of targets at once, you need a AoE skill which is basically destined for that. And if you want something else than elemental arrows, I'd recommend taking a look at these. So let's start with Twin Chakrams. Twin Chakrams received a buff with patch 1.0.4. And if you remember episode 1 of the Build Factory, I said that this skill wasn't really on par compared to other skills concerning the damage. And to be quite frank, it's still kind of useless on Inferno. I tried it out for a few hours now, and there are still the same problems. It is still too weak in my opinion. The damage buff was slight, and it isn't really recognizable in my opinion. That can be due to the fact that I use a two-handed crossbow. But I have my doubts that this skill is really that much better if you have a bow or 2 one-handed crossbows. In my opinion, it is still kind of useless, and it takes up a skill slot which you can use for something better. It still has the same problems, low damage output, and it can go around enemies. In my opinion, you can try other rune choices, but other than that, I would still recommend using a whole other skill altogether. Next up on our list is Spike Trap with Scatter, and to be quite frank, I didn't use this skill for quite some time now, and I couldn't really remember how awesome it was to use this spell. It was really fun and a really big change compared to other AoE centric skills. The damage output is quite decent. I would really recommend trying the spell, but there are a few minor things that you have to keep in mind in order to make it work properly. For one, it is only 3 bombs or 3 spike traps at a time. You can't spam this skill. Once you place 3 spike traps down on the ground, you can't spam any more spike traps, or the other ones you just planted will disappear. And with a hatred cost of 30, you really have to aim carefully. Aim is the next and best transition. Aiming is so important, since the spike traps are not instant impact damage. Once you place them down on the ground, they won't explode instantly. It takes 1 to 2 seconds till they are charged. So if you want to attack enemies which move really fast or which teleport, you have to have a decent aim. You have to aim right beforehand and right in front of them, for instance, if they are running fast, up to you. Another thing that I also mentioned back then is the random nature of placing them on the ground. Sometimes it happens that they all get piled up on one. In these cases it is awesome for single target damage. In small corridors it is more likely to happen, and it is more likely to happen if you place them near a wall as well. But if you want to go for AoE kind of damage, it really doesn't matter whatsoever, because if the enemies are piled up all together, they all will be damaged, so you don't have to worry about that too much. It is worth a try, and I would really recommend looking into it if you want that kind of playstyle. And last but not least, we have Multi-Shot. And Multi-Shot back then on the initial release of Diablo 3 wasn't really that great, and the reason behind this was that it was too hatred heavy. You couldn't really make use of it that great. But since the patch 1.0.4, The feeling of Diablo 2 is back full force in Diablo 3 as well, and this is just awesome. With a hatred cost of 30, it is really much affordable now. You can basically use this spell to good avail, and I'd really recommend taking a look at it. If you go for the Fire Drill rune, for instance, you can basically spam this skill. 15 hatred is really nothing. It is really awesome, because if you consider your hatred regeneration as well, if you have hatred regeneration, you can't really run out of hatred with Fire at will. So that's why I use full broadside. I have more damage, and 30 hatred for an AoE spell, that's quite alright. You can make it work quite easily, and like I already said, it's a massive AoE and a lot of damage is inflicted to your enemies. That's really awesome and a lot of fun. It feels just like an Amazon in Diablo 2. And that's the feeling I loved about Diablo 2 back then. And the only thing I have to criticize, it's a minor thing, but you have to keep that in mind when fighting a lot of enemies at once. The range isn't really that high. You have to keep that in mind. It is really important, because if the enemies are too far away, you won't inflict any damage on them if you use multi-shot. You just have to think about it like a shotgun. If they are close by and really piled up together and close together as well, you just can do so much damage at once, and it is really awesome and a lot of fun as well. And that wraps it up for the damage. Now let's talk about survivability. Since there are not that many changes on survivability skills, there isn't really that much to talk about, and since I did a lot of episodes concerning survivability skills as well, I would recommend consulting them if you need further details on certain topics. But I want to talk about these skills anyway, since this is a basic review of episode 1. So let's start things with Smokescreen. Like every demon hunter should know by now, Smokescreen is your basic bread and butter survival skill. It makes you invulnerable for the time being, it makes you break free of movement impairing effects, and not to forget, it increases your movement speed if you go for tactical advantage as one of your passive skills as well. So it really comes in handy if you want to stay alive on Inferno difficulty. Back then, it was really imbalanced. A lot of people don't like to hear it, but it was overpowered. I talked about it on the second episode of the Diablo 3 build factory, and back then you could use it up to 3 seconds. It was crazy. You could basically tank any incoming damage with Smokescreen if you had enough discipline in your repertoire. It was amazing. Nowadays it is just 1 or 1.5 seconds if you have Lingering Fog as your rune of choice. And to be honest, 1.5 seconds is still enough if you know how to use the skill properly. You just need to know when it is necessary to dodge an attack and when it is necessary to get out of a movement impairing effect. You don't need that long duration to stay alive. That was really overpowered. And like I already said, it is your basic bread and butter survival skill. It shouldn't be missed in any build. Unless you go for Shadow Power plus Gloom. There are certain cases where Shadow Power plus Gloom is much stronger than Smokescreen. Shadow Power plus Gloom has the benefits of a longer duration. Also the benefits of Life Leech once you activate it. So if you can hit 1 crushing blow or 2 crushing blows to your enemies, you can charge up your HP quite fast, so that's something you should consider if you are into Life Leech. What you can't forget about is that Gloom doesn't make you invincible, you just take 60% less damage. 60% is quite nice, but you can't forget, you're not invulnerable. Also, you can't break free of movement impairing effects, so if you get used to it, to break out of movement impairing effects of Smokescreen, that can be a quite big shake-up from your current playstyle if you are used to Smokescreen, for instance. Some people claim that with Shadow Power you turn immortal once you have that certain level of gear, and I wouldn't really deny it. Smokescreen compared to Shadow Power plus Gloom really has no chance if you have that certain amount of gear level. The reason behind this is, once you get a few hits and you activate Shadow Power plus Gloom, you basically recharge your life so fast that you really don't die anymore. It is really awesome and worth a try if you've reached that certain level of gear. But until then, I would recommend going for Smokescreen. It is just the better all-rounder. If you want further details concerning this topic, I'd recommend checking out episode 17 of the Build Factory. I talk about this topic there in more detail. Next up on our list is Vault, and if you remember episode 1 of the Build Factory, I talked about how to utilize Vault correctly, how to vault away from your enemies, what you have to pay attention to, and so on and so forth. Since then a lot has changed. A lot of people just threw Vault out of their builds, and to be quite frank, I did that as well. It wasn't really that necessary since you had Shadow Power or Smokescreen. So what's the point in going for Vault as well? So with patch 1.0.4 I figured, okay, I talked about Vault back then, let's talk about it now as well. And since they patched a really nice rune addition to Vault into the game with 1.0.4, I thought, okay, let's do something crazy. Let's try a build without Smokescreen or Shadow Power. And to be quite frank, it worked out quite well. I was really surprised, even for offensive purposes. So even if you are vaulting right into the enemies or right beside them or next to them, it worked out quite fine because the 1500% weapon damage is ridiculously high. You can't imagine how fast enemies die to that. It is really insane. And to be quite frank, it is really awesome if you use it against champions or uniques with the fast affix. It really also works with champions which have the teleport affix as well, but especially against champions with fast affix. If you try to keep them at bay, or if you try to keep your distance and you use Trail of Cinders, of course you can't forget about using your normal attacks as well, that's obvious. But if you use Trail of Cinders with Vault against them, that worked out quite nice. They take a significant amount of damage and it helps out a lot. I couldn't really grasp the concept how awesome that is for your build. So I had really no problems whatsoever on Act 3 with Vault instead of Smokescreen. So if you want to give that a shot, go right ahead. But one more thing, you have to keep an eye on your discipline. It is really fun to vault right into the enemies and right out of them again with Trail of Cinders and watch them all burn. But if you run out of discipline, that can go wrong pretty fast. So pay attention to your discipline as well. The last two spells are Preparation plus Battle Scars and the Bad Companion. Preparation plus Battle Scars is the basic help me out of here button. If you run out of discipline and health, it is really a good addition to your build. I basically use it more for healing myself than to regenerate my discipline in tough situations. It is really awesome because your basic health pot is just about 1200 HP, and if you are a demon hunter with 60k HP or more, 1200 really doesn't cut it. But if you go for Battle Scars, it really helps out a lot. And even if you need that discipline, recharging your discipline to have more Shadow Power or more Smokescreen available, or even more Vault if you want to, is really a nice addition to your build. The Bad Companion on the other hand is important for your Hatred regeneration. If you have enough Hatred regeneration concerning your Quiver for instance, or you don't really need it, you can easily replace it. But from personal experience, the Bad Companion is kind of a necessity. It really comes in handy in most builds, especially Hatred heavy builds such as a Cluster Arrow build for instance. So I wouldn't really miss it out. So take it and have a lot of fun with it. And that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much for watching, it is really much appreciated. I hope you enjoyed this review episode of the Build Factory. It was really important to me to review the first episode since so much has changed. And with patch 1.0.4 I felt that the time was right to do that episode. So thanks again for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to press that like button down there. And if you want to stay up to date for more Diablo 3 content, make sure to subscribe to that channel. It is really much appreciated. And until then, I will see you guys next time. Take care, have a good one, and goodbye.